I would be targeting beans as the priority really once ground dries out, or once you can move in the field that you've selected. I suppose the other point to make is the economics stack up really, really well. In our cost and returns, we factored in a protein payment of 500 a hectare, which would make it the second most profitable crop after winter wheat.
As the mornings and evenings gradually get longer, it's easy to look out at fields and ponder what agronomy needs are needed. Most winter crops have come through the season well, which may encourage farmers to put in extra effort to maximise the potential this year. You are listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. We'd really appreciate it if you could listen, follow and give us a review on Apple or Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. There's always a temptation to get into fields as soon as they become passable, but crop needs should dictate what actions are taken in the coming weeks. I'm delighted to be joined today by Ciaran Collins, a Tillage Specialist in Teagasc, and John Pettit, a Tillage Enterprise Advisor based in Wexford. Ciaran, I'd like to come to you first. What's your assessment of how crops have come through the winter in your area?
Overall good, you'd have to say good. I suppose helped firstly by good sowing conditions, particularly in October. I definitely think the scars, I suppose, of the two previous autumns led to maybe slightly earlier sowing, and those crops are quite forward maybe in some places. But I think the ones that would have been sown at sort of normal timings are in good shape. I suppose the first thing you're always looking for coming out of the winter is, are there any bare patches? And I think that's minimal, I think, really. So in a general sense, good. There are some, I suppose, later sown crops, mainly wheat, that slugs would have got at, stuff that would have went in after late beans or maybe maize or beet or something like that. That mightn't be great looking, but they're the small end really. I think in the main crops look reasonably good, I think. Well set up.
And I suppose, as you mentioned, there are some crops have been sown quite early. Maybe there's some crops need action in the spring over the next few weeks sooner than others. Which crops will require action first?
I suppose there's already some fertilizer gone out on certainly nitrogen and oilseed rape and maybe some of the more backward crops or where pigeons have grazed. There's probably some nitrogen or compound fertilizer gone out on winter barley as well. And that's probably the first of the cereals that would require attention. I'd say wheat after that and then oats really.
So going back to the oilseed rape, you mentioned that pigeons have been doing a bit of grazing this year. Is it worse this year than other years, do you think?
It's hard to know. I personally I think it is. Though I don't really know why, but like there's big variations in GAI, green area index figures. Like you're getting up to over 2.5 in some crops that weren't grazed, and then obviously down to maybe obviously less than 1 where grazing was heavy. So I think really the priority there obviously is getting out on those thinner crops, crops with low GAIs, with the first split of nitrogen. That could be maybe 60 kilos of nitrogen, maybe something in around 50 units, say. And I would say a lot of that's probably done already, but if it's not, it certainly is a priority at this stage. You need to get those crops moving or have nitrogen there when that first burst of growth comes,
And in terms of disease control, there's normally a little bit of a concern this time of the year with some diseases in oilseed rape. Is there any of that concern this year?
I haven't seen a whole lot of light leaf spot yet or had too many reports, to be honest, either. Now, we did see a share of foam in the autumn, and I suppose given the nature of the autumn, a good few growers were able to get out with maybe some proteoconazole-based products in the autumn. However, our experience with light leaf spot, I think once you kind of get from this time of year on and that growth, starts, I think it is very worthwhile getting in with, say, a proteo-based product there to give you control of light leaf spot. It can be very damaging, and look, we've got wet weather. Now it's been cold up to now, I suppose, but now we've got wet and milder conditions, and those conditions would favor light leaf spot. So, as soon as ground dries up and the fertilizer is out, I think I would be targeting light leaf spot after that, really.
John, just moving across to you in terms of, and Ciaran did mention winter barley. It's generally the first crop that kind of takes off. Is there any attention needed in winter barley at the moment?
I suppose, Michael, it boils down to the individual crops, so not all crops will be treated the same. So, like, you have some individuals that have winter barley drilled after break crops, such as beans and winter oilseed rape. Those crops have wintered extremely well and look really well at the moment. There's a good deep green colour in them, so there's no shortage of nitrogen present within the plant itself. So those crops, Michael, there's no need to rush into them whatsoever. And in those cases as well, they're carrying crops, or plants are carrying plenty of tillers, so there's adequate tillers per square meter, like to optimize yield as well. So I wouldn't be rushing into those crops.
Growers tend to get quite excited, I suppose, if they see a bit of yellowing or a yellow hue across crops. Is that a key sign that something should be done, or is that just one of nature's kind of things that there's old leaves there, or what does that tell us?
I think, Michael, if you're looking at it depends on the weather conditions at the time as well. So, like, if you take presently wet weather, like you'd expect to see crops yellowing a bit anyway. That's going to happen. If it was an alternative year and if you had a drier spell of weather, and you had growth there and you had crops looking that bit yellower, crops weren't as green as what you'd like. And plus on top of that, if you didn't have adequate tiller numbers as well, at that stage you would consider going out that bit earlier. So there's treatments for various different crops, Mike. You need to look at what you have. If you've got crops with adequate tiller numbers, start with, if they're a little bit on the yellow side, I wouldn't be in a mad rush to go into a field. You still have to be conscious of the fact that you have adequate tiller numbers. If you've got a crop where tiller numbers are less than adequate, and if a crop is yellow or doesn't have that as green a colour as what you'd like, you might be that bit more inclined to go into the crop that bit earlier. But at the same time, you need to be conscious of soil temperature. There's no point in going into a field unless you've got adequate soil temperature to induce growth. And at the same time, you need to be aware of forthcoming rainfall as well. So if you're going to be dealing with heavy rainfall events over the coming days or week or 10 days, you'll hold off as well.
So, John, we had a number of crop walks all around the country in the last few days. And at those walks, we talked a little bit about how wide the window was for applying fertilizer to winter barley. You might explain why that is.
Based on research completed in Oak Park over a number of years, it is shown that literally the optimum time to apply nitrogen one year with the next is early March. So again, if an individual makes the decision to go out with nitrogen early, say let it be mid-February, the potential for high levels of rainfall thereafter they're substantial enough, and we've actually seen it in recent weeks. So if you're going to go out with 40, 50 units in mid-February, the potential to lose a substantial amount of that is actually quite high, right? So you're going to end up with a poor nitrogen use efficiency rate on what you've applied at that period. And ultimately, Michael, that means that like the amount of nitrogen used by the crop then reduced thereafter, which can have a detrimental effect on yield. So the crop's not getting as much nitrogen as what it should.
Okay, so you kind of so there's a potential to lose out overall. So as you say, going back to the first nitrogen for winter barley is generally around early March, I think you were saying. But does it make any difference, John, if that's a second barley, in other words, a second cereal? So say it's, as lots of cases are, as maybe winter barley after winter wheat. Would you be tempted to go a bit earlier in that scenario?
Michael, again, a lot of barleys are actually drilled after wheat, so they're a second after break. So in that scenario as well, you're more prone to take all. So considering the risk of take all, yes, you'll be conscious of the fact, yeah, I might go that bit earlier. But again, Michael, it still involves looking at the crop, like what colour is in the crop. If you've got a good deep colour in the crop to start with, there's plenty of nitrogen in the crop, I'd still be inclined to hold off. If you've got a crop that's looking maybe that little bit on the yellow side, a little bit more than what you'd like, yeah, at that point in time, you might decide, yeah, I'll go that bit earlier.
So, Ciaran, just come across to you in terms of the growth regulation for winter barley. A lot of people like to apply growth regulator this time of year. Is it too early, or should people be considering getting it out around now?
Yeah, I suppose it's a hot topic at a lot of the crop walks, and that, you know, when do I go, and very often, and it happens year in, year out, you know, there can be sheer crop damage from not alone growth regulators, but maybe a combination of growth regulators, herbicides, even fungicides when temperatures or crop growth isn't great, you know. So I think we need to be careful. I suppose in terms of actual growth regulation, I'm talking about, you know, shortening or strengthening the stem of the crop. You're talking about growth stage 30 really, and we're quite a bit away from growth stage 30, despite maybe even some of the earlier ones. We tend to have maybe a little bit more leaf, and they do look a little bit more advanced, but when you actually go in, there's no sign of stem extension there. So I think that's, for me, that's probably off, and it could be into to mid-March before that timing happens. So that's the first thing I wouldn't be rushing in. And I think secondly, on growth regulation, it doesn't all have to be done at growth stage 30. It's a time when you're possibly trying to do wild oats and possibly disease control and that as well. So I'd be looking at the crop in front of me in terms of shoot numbers. Is it excessively thick or not? And secondly, I kind of refer to the Department of Agriculture variety ratings. I remember being in Ballydown last year looking at the plots, the high nitrogen ones, which are, assessed for lodging. And, the likes of Tardis and Joyu in particular, and Cassia maybe to a lesser extent, stood really, really well. So, and there are three big varieties out there. So, if you have those varieties, take Joyu, it's a 7 for resistance to lodging, a 7 for straw breakdown. That doesn't need the same treatment as maybe a weaker strawed variety, say something like Molly, for argument's sake. So I think you kind of have to judge what's in front of you. And just be aware then, if you are doing it, just be aware that, you need good growthy conditions. And that's when growth regulators work well, and we do less crop damage.
And you also mentioned disease there, Ciaran. Is there any disease pressure out there at the moment? Is there or what's the, I suppose, the program for winter barley? Do we need to start when you talked about growth regulation there at growth stage 30?
Yeah, look, the disease control in barley is all about minding those small tillers. When we get disease on those lower tillers, we can lose them, and it can have the effect of thinning out crops. So I think really, again, I'd be looking at the resistance to, I suppose mildew, rinco, and net blotch are the key ones. All the varieties we have at the moment, the winter barley ones, are good on net blotch. I suppose from a rinco perspective, we're lucky enough as well. They're all very good except for cassia. So if you have cassia, you're keeping an eye on that for rinco, and I think that is definitely a case for getting in early, possibly turning into a tree spray program. The one I'd be watching for this year is mildew. We've 3 varieties that would be relatively weak for mildew. There's cassia, joyu, and integral. So, we did see mildew in those last year, so that's something I would be keeping an eye on. Protea is very good preventatively, but you might need something else with the mildew side if there's a lot of mildew in the crop. But getting Protea in early on those would certainly be a help. And just finally on disease, I'd be watching barley, following barley. We did see net blotch there in the autumn. It's pretty much gone now. Look, as I said, all our varieties have pretty good ratings, but if you have a carryover of volunteers, that can bring net blotch into a crop. So if you're in that scenario, just keep an eye on that one as well.
So John, just to bring you back in terms of winter wheat, a lot of crops are looking pretty well from what I can see. Is there any need to go with nitrogen on those crops in the next couple of weeks?
The answer, Michael, in the vast majority of cases, I would say is no. Again, I suppose we do need to be conscious of the fact that our fungicide armory has weakened in recent years, and going in with early nitrogen, we need to be conscious of the consequences of going in with early nitrogen. Like if you're going to apply early nitrogen to a crop of winter wheat, you're going to promote or induce additional tiller production. That's going to increase the risk of lodging. It's going to increase the risk of septoria. You're going to have a base in a crop that's going to be wetter for longer periods of time. It's going to be harder to get chemical down into a crop when you're applying fungicides as well. So that'll have an effect on septoria control. Also mildew, if you've got dense crops as well, mildew can often take hold in the base of crops, and it can be very, very hard to control as well. And you can find yourself chasing it for the whole season. I suppose on top of that as well, finally, you have the likes of fusarium disease. Even in the best case scenario, you're looking at 50% control with a well-timed fungicide. So if you've got thick crops, Michael, you're going to be far more prone to fusarium as well. So I suppose when we look at applying nitrogen, we need to be conscious of the implications of doing that, particularly for disease control, but also from a lodging perspective as well.
So one year with the other, John, when should growers be kind of targeting it? Is it in 2 weeks' time or 3 weeks' time?
Generally, Michael, in around mid-March is when I will be going
Okay.
with the first of my nitrogen. But obviously, there will be some exceptions to that, Michael. We do have some crops that have been hit badly with slugs. So we've got some tin crops out there. So like those crops will need to get some early nitrogen to induce tiller and to thicken those crops as well. But they're the exception, Michael.
Ciaran, we might be a little bit early for this, I suppose, really, but we did talk about growth regulators there in winter barley. Is there a number of varieties out there in the winter wheat where growers just need to be a little bit more conscious this year in comparison to other years?
I think so. There's two reasons. Firstly, as John said there, we've got good establishment, high shoot numbers. Well, that obviously increases lodging risk now. However, I suppose Graham and Dawson would have been the two main varieties that we would have had and still have for the last number of years. And we know they're really good, especially Dawson in terms of straw strength. However, there's a good bit of Champion growing this year, and that's only a 5 for resistance to lodging. So I'd be really, really careful on that one. And going back to John's point there, if I've got a crop of Champion and it's quite thick, the first measure to take to reduce lodging risk is delaying and probably taking a little bit of nitrogen off the top there, because that is going to be the big driver of lodging there. As I said, in the last few years, 2 litres of Cycel, well timed at start to stem extension 31, has done a great job, and I don't think we've had any great issues with that in the last number of years. However, if I have a very thick crop or something like Champion, I think you may look at maybe a split growth regulator program would help there. Maybe getting in like the winter barley, maybe at growth stage 30, and then a top up maybe at 31 with a bit of Cycel at that stage, and that'll just reduce the risk a little bit, I think.
John, just going, so maybe rounding off the last of the winter crops here. Winter oats have, from what I've heard and seen, have taken a little bit of a hit this year. There was a bit of frost this year, and there was, I suppose, a bit of damage reported here and there. How are crops looking in your area?
I suppose, Michael, the area winter oats down in the area here in Wexford generally has increased dramatically in the autumn gone by. Again, there's 2 different crops there, Michael. You have winter oats that were drilled in the first half of October, and you've winter oats that were drilled in November, and they're 2 different crops that will require 2 separate strategies in terms of management as well. So the earlier drilled crops, Michael, are very strong, and I'd emphasize the word very as well. So they're going to be particularly prone to lodging. Rust, I suppose, is our biggest issue in Wexford as well. Whereas you go further north, mildew is a bigger issue, and inland. So crops will want to be monitored closely in the month of March for rust coming into them as well. Those later drilled crops, Michael, are looking very well. They'll be very, very easily managed. Again, won't be as prone to rust, won't be as prone to lodging. But I think the main message to individual with oats as well is there is absolutely no rush in terms of going in with nitrogen. Particularly with those earlier drilled crops, the worst thing you could do is go in with nitrogen early. You're going to induce further growth. You're going to increase lodging pressure by doing so. Those crops, Michael, would be a lot better if they were let go a little, let them turn a little bit yellow, or let them go a little bit anemic before you actually apply nitrogen to them. And that will reduce the risk of lodging. Again, early nitrogen as well, Michael, will promote disease within a crop as well. So, I think the main message is don't rush into oats with nitrogen.
Okay, you're talking about a good couple of weeks at least, if not a little bit longer.
Generally, I would say, Michael, it's definitely mid-March, and I'd say absolutely no earlier.
Ciaran, I just want to finish out on a last question, I suppose, around spring crops, and that's only around the corner. There might have been a few people got beans in the last bit of a dry spell. Probably won't be anything done now for, given all the weather over the last few days, for the next maybe a couple of weeks. Good few farmers were caught out last year planting beans very late. Have we changed our opinion in terms of the ideal sowing date to try and get that harvest date to be at a reasonable time of the year in the back end?
No, definitely. I suppose, look, last year beans went late. The weather just didn't play ball, and look, we ran out of crop options, I suppose, really, and beans went in late, and we obviously suffered the consequences in terms of late harvest and high moisture. But, I think any time from now to say certainly St. Patrick's Day, that's sort of what have we got, a 4-week odd window. I think that's pretty much ideal. Once you go after St. Patrick's Day, you're certainly pushing your harvest date out. And on average, you're going to get a lower yield as well. So look, I would be targeting beans as I suppose the priority really once ground dries out, or once you can move in the field that you've selected. And I suppose the other point to make is the economics stack up really, really well. The protein payment is there. In our cost and returns, we factored in a protein payment of 500 a hectare, which would make it the second most profitable crop after winter wheat. Look, that may be higher. It can get closer to 600 depending on the area sown. There's a good forward price there that Dairygold came out with there of 240 as well. So look, I think financially you couldn't make a case against beans, but certainly the lessons from last year is getting them sown as soon as possible. And maybe, Michael, just one last point on the sowing, just to keep an eye on the 1,000 grain weight. Some of the native seed tends to be very big, when you're getting to 600 and 650 even, so just watch that in terms of sowing rate there. You could be as high as 250 kilos per hectare, so just keep an eye on that one, really.
Okay, Ciaran, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. And John, thank you very much for that. We'll be back to you again all the way throughout the season, just to see how crops are going, and to, again, give some more of that really good advice you gave today. Thanks very much, guys.
Thanks, lads.
Thanks, Michael.
So that's it for this episode, and my thanks to Ciaran and John for joining me on the podcast. So if you enjoy the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening. I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.